Thank you.
Well, great. Thank you, Medea, for getting us kicked off this afternoon. For those who don't know, I'm Eric Backus. Today representing Clarkson University, which is my day job, but I also happen to be privileged to be one of the steering committee members for this resiliency series of lunch and learns that have been going on since the beginning of 2022. This is sponsored by or led by the U.S. Green Building Council, Middle Atlantic and New England regions, as well as in full partnership with the Society of American Military Engineers, New York City Post. So really glad to have this thing. And today's topic, as kind of was brought up, is on community vitality. And we are really glad to have these opportunities to have these conversations. All these topics we've had in our series have came out of last year's series. We have a 2021 series where we're in the middle of a pandemic, but talking about things. And all these came out of issues and discussions we had around resilience and resiliency in our communities, and how we might look at them in new ways. And so thankfully we had several people step up to to do the job of being a task force leader, and to do that. And so I really am glad to be able to introduce today the one who was a task force leader for this particular task force around community vitality to lead us and facilitate our discussion today, Mr. Ryan Kolkler from the Vice President of Innovation for the International Code Council. You might have heard of those people. Those are the code people that we all touch base with on so many different levels of all communities around the world these days, with it being an International Code Council. But he also is double-headed, and God bless him for doing this, as the Executive Director for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. So perfect person to talk about community vitality and community resilience, as has been leading the benchmarking process that they've been developing over the last several years. So with all that, thank you, Ryan, for leading us, and I'm looking forward to being part of the panel with you today. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric, and really appreciate the opportunity to be here to discuss such a vital topic, particularly as May is Building Safety Month. And so as we think about sort of community vitality and the role that buildings play in supporting communities every day, businesses, housing, and really being some of the sort of cohesion that creates communities. But there are so many other different aspects of community vitality that we'll also touch on today. I'm joined by an excellent panel of folks. I've had the pleasure with working with all of these folks on various different aspects of community resilience, and we'll touch on sort of the various different angles that these folks come at it from. But certainly the sort of core recognition that we all need to sort of figure out the intersections and really work together to address some of the community resilience, community vitality challenges. So let me introduce our panelists, and then I'll give them a chance to talk a little bit about their work before we dive into some of the questions. So we have Antoine Richards, who's the Chief of Staff at the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. We have Eric Backus, who just introduced himself, Director of Construction Engineering Management Program at Clarkson, and several other things as well, which he can certainly talk about. Ilya Azaroff, who's the Director of Design, Resilience, and Regenerative Strategies at Plus Lab Architects. Kathryn Burgess, who's Vice President of Land Use and Development at Smart Growth America. So why don't we each take a couple minutes and talk about our work. I might as well kick it off since I do have the mic initially. As Eric mentioned, I do wear two hats. One is at the International Code Council as Vice President of Innovation, where I direct our Center of Focus on energy resilience and innovation. And so really looking at opportunities for the Code Council through things like building codes, but also other tools and strategies that really can support communities in achieving their resilience, sustainability, and safety goals. And then, through the Alliance for National and Community Resilience, we are looking at a system of community resilience benchmarks for actually 19 different community functions that cut across the social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities, really providing a holistic vision for communities of where they are today and where they can head to into the future. And we can certainly touch on, as part of the conversation, the importance of having that holistic vision across social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities to really get to that community vitality. So I'll turn it over to Antoine, who's working in a whole variety of different areas and has some great expertise to share with the group. So tell us a little bit about your work and interests.
Excellent. Thanks for that introduction, Ryan. And it's really a pleasure to be here with this stellar panel and really to speak with you all today. So I'm really appreciative of this opportunity. As Ryan mentioned, I work with the Institute for Diversity and Inclusion in Emergency Management. That is a mouthful, right? So we call it IDEM for short. So you say IDEM, you'll get me every time. In my role, I serve as chief of staff. So I really work with the organization to drive a lot of their programs and initiatives and make sure that the organization is achieving their mission and their goals, not only in the short term, but also our long-term strategies and strategic foresight. So it's a lot of fun. It actually opens up the door to do a lot of different things, from policy review and analysis, working on the ground with communities, and really getting in and developing and implementing programs that are geared towards increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion for the emergency management sector. And that includes local, state, federal, public, nonprofit, and private. Overall, the organization is a nonprofit, a global nonprofit, and we focus on integrating equity into all aspects of emergency management. And our mission is really set on supporting the development and implementation of innovative community-based mitigation and adaptation projects. So to put that in layman's terms, we work with communities and we really look at where inequities exist in disasters. We look at where there are disproportionate impacts of disasters, and we work directly with communities to really achieve more equitable outcomes. But then we also have programs that are pipeline, that are really built around increasing leadership diversity in emergency management. And we also have other initiatives that work with small businesses. I could speak all day about the work that we do, but there's a lot of things that we really help coordinate. For a little background on me, my background is actually in public health. I got my master's of public health from Morehouse School of Medicine. And my bachelor's is in communication and media studies from Kennesaw State. So I have a very non-linear approach to emergency management, which is where I ended up with my doctorate degree from Jacksonville State. So a lot of perspective, as Ryan said. I'm really glad to share it. I'm happy to be here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Antoine. And Antoine is actually the newest board member for the Alliance for National and Community Resilience. So I'm certainly pleased to have him on board as sharing his expertise with Anchor. Eric, I know you shared a little bit about sort of your work, but maybe some of the specific aspects, relative to this community vitality and community resilience conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Ryan, for the chance to kind of chip in. So my background as former U.S. Army Corps of Engineer officer, female liaison officer for 3 years at the Pentagon. So I did a lot of work in addressing national security, but also looking at it from the domestic perspective of how we respond to disasters. And part of my work now here at Clarkson, now that I'm retired from the Army, has been really in how to make communities or make organizations make better facilities or infrastructure decisions going forward, but thinking them not just as an infrastructural problem, but thinking of them as social, economic, and ecological challenges to address. And so we start thinking about bringing those the fuller, sometimes we call it triple bottom line. I kind of call it the quadruple bottom line when you start thinking about this, because you have the physical side, is how do we do that well? And so a lot of my research and work has been on the idea of developing what we call sustainable holistic planning systems, where we really think about planning, development, design in our communities in ways that actually think through and develop in a very holistic, sustainable way that inherently is more resilient. And so a huge part of that is how well communities can do that. And it starts to recognize that the conversations are much larger than just an analytical model that we as engineers might like to do. That's my background is in civil engineering and engineering science, but it involves the social sciences. It involves the community as its own organization. And so the only way that these can work well is by understanding and how vital those community members are and how they're part of the conversation. And so a lot of my work has been working with communities and trying to figure that out and working in community as the research I do to make sure that we're really validating where things are going and where they want to go to make communities better. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation today with everybody else. Really glad to be able to have this chance to meet you and work with you this afternoon.
Great. Thanks so much, Eric. I'm going to turn it over to Ilya, who's trained as an architect, but I think can certainly expand on sort of how that base has brought him to address some of these challenges. So Ilya, go ahead.
Thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here. As Ryan said, I'm an architect, but my first training was actually in geography. And coupled with that, I also grew up in Tornado Alley, seeing disasters growing up. It really put me in a position where I started to understand early on that my career may want to take me to a place where architects and architecture itself may have a solution for some of these wicked problems. And so as a practitioner, as well as someone who's really involved in informing some of the policy issues, we kind of take this on as something between the proactive and reactive, and understanding that training, response, or reacting to a post-disaster situation is sort of where we're at. And the difficult work is always in the proactive side, recognizing where communities need to go, recognizing the shocks and stresses and hazards that are in front of us, and adapting to that. So the other things as an architect, we broadly strive for, on the holistic sense, a blueprint for better, one that needs to address across all the sectors, similar to what Eric is talking about, and a systems approach that when we look at this, any project at any scale, whether it's working with frontline communities and working on the soft elements of resilience and capacity building, we strive to answer the questions around not just resilience, but sustainable future that embeds equity into our responses. My own work, we often create prototypes that demonstrate to communities and governing bodies that we can do things much better, and that code is an absolute minimum. We can achieve a greater degree of resilience as well as equity through a cost-effective, much more recognizable and attainable solution. Because quite frankly, resilience doesn't have to look different, it just has to perform differently. And if we take that into a true model for the future, it unlocks the process for everyone, every stakeholder around the globe. And I guess lastly, the other things that we're involved with, I'm happy to have worked with Ryan on the anchor process. The scales that we really look at are that individual building scale, which we've done prototypes that have changed federal policy on how to rebuild after disasters, but we were also working with Anchor and just went through with the city of Oakland Park an amazing process benchmarking. So at those two scales, you can actually see the gaps and the future, and the key is the roadmap in between, and then the prototype that is the touchstone where everyone can recognize we can get there. So that's maybe a long-winded response, but Ryan, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ilya, and certainly looking forward to the contributions to the conversation. You talked about scale, so now I'm going to turn it over to Kathryn to talk about her work. Primarily sort of thinking about planning and those sorts of activities. So, Kathryn, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Ryan, for hosting us today, and it's been great already to hear a bit more about everyone's work on the panel. So I'm Kathryn Burgess, and I lead the Land Use and Development team at Smart Growth America. We're a national nonprofit which advances sustainable, equitable development, and we do federal advocacy, technical assistance for communities, and thought leadership. And we're very much focused on transit-oriented development, walkable development, and helping put the policies in place which can deliver that kind of vision and neighborhood opportunity. So a big focus for me is how land use and development can help communities be more prepared for the impacts of climate change, thinking both about acute events like hurricanes and chronic issues like sea level rise. And I first became passionate about this topic, at the start of my career working in post-Katrina, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So, as a planner getting my start, I was working on hosting workshops run by neighborhood groups and also sponsored by the state of Louisiana and state of Mississippi. And these workshops were largely focused on, housing recovery and strategies for rebuilding. And so, as we're talking about the kind of foundational discussion on resilience and equity, first getting my start in an environment like that where, communities lost so much and the inequities were so clear, really drove me to try to work in this field and address some of the systemic policy issues. I'll also observe that from then until now, the idea of resilience was framed very differently. climate wasn't a big part of the conversation. You know, there was a lot of discussion about being prepared for future hurricanes, but not necessarily, the fact that storms are likely to become increasingly frequent and intense. And there was also less of a focus on landscape and regional opportunities for ecological resilience and sort of natural systems thinking. So, I think there's so much to do, but as an industry, I also think we've made significant progress since that point. So that's a bit about what got me started. And since then, I've worked in both consulting and the not-for-profit sector, focused on community resilience and planning.
Great. So as you see, we have a very diverse panel of expertise and folks that sort of look at the community vitality and community resilience picture from a wide variety of angles. Let me start, and I guess we'll go backwards and start with you, Kathryn. How would you define community vitality, and then maybe how does your work sort of specifically support or respond to sort of the components of that definition?
Sure. Well, I'm excited to hear how everyone answers this question differently, because I think there are many common themes, but it's also a topic that everyone can interpret in different ways. So I'll bring community vitality back to Smart Growth America's North Star, which is, the ultimate goal of everything that we do. And that's a country where no matter who you are or where you live, you can enjoy living in a neighborhood that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. So to me, that's really community vitality right there. And I'm trying to address it through a built environment and community planning focus, where we're really looking both at federal policies. So, funding opportunities like the infrastructure bill, which will be, leading to infrastructure investment in communities nationally. And also state and local policy. And a special interest of ours is zoning, and now the inequities which can be advanced through zoning as it is now, opportunities for zoning reform, which can deliver more attainable housing and opportunities for small businesses to thrive, et cetera. So that is, and a final focus for me is looking at climate adaptation and land use and vitality. I think a community cannot be vibrant if it's not safe to be there, if households are concerned about flooding, if people don't have access to the resources to protect them from public health crises like extreme heat. So I'm looking at all of these topics from a land use and development perspective. So I guess that's where I'll start. And I know there'll be more to say as each person adds their definition. I'm sure we'd all have more to build from.
Yeah, that's great. So Ilya, let me turn it to you. Your definition and sort of how it impacts your work.
Sure, absolutely. So to me, as a systems thinker, communities are made up of systems, whether they're social systems, infrastructure systems, and buildings as systems. And a vital community to me is one that those systems usually support one another to achieve a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. That's easy to say, but it's very hard to do. So a vital community is one where citizens feel as though that they have a stake in their community in the future. And what that means is that there's a degree of self-determination supported by circular economies, reliable and sustainable resources that are within a local distance, as well as a high degree of integrated resilience that can withstand shocks and stresses, whether that's climate-driven or human-driven. So in my mind, a vital community is also one that is on the way to achieving some very specific goals. One, the disaster risk reduction goals, as well as its sustainable development goals. So if you really think about that, we always look at a touchstone of the Sendai 2030 DRR, as well as the 2030 commitments for your SDGs. They're parallel tracks, and more often than not, as architects, we kind of look mainly at the easier part, which is the reduction of carbon. That's mitigation, but what's the hard thing is to do disaster risk reduction on an adaptive, large scale, as well as resilience at the very small scale to support those businesses and equity and people. So that's where I'll stop.
Great. Appreciate that perspective. Eric, from your perspective.
One of the things that I actually have we talk about vital community. I'm actually going to talk about how communities gain vitality. And I think, to me, a big part of this is we think about the term resilience to begin with. Resilience often is defined simply as the ability to bounce back from a disturbance or from an acute trauma of some sort, right? It was always chronic traumas that actually were engaging through our life. So there's ongoing stresses to the system, but there's the acute ones. Kathryn brought up Hurricane Katrina being a huge one. It's very well known. And we could say here in the New York metro area, Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy was another acute one. The ability to bounce back, that's why resilience. But if we think about community gaining vitality, part of that is to build the ability in lots of ways to bounce back. And bouncing back isn't just, hey, can we now go through the Holland Tunnel again? Right. And that was a huge issue when we're talking about Superstorm Sandy. Or we can have stable barriers around Lake Pontchartrain in New Orleans, so we can get the Ninth Ward back. Seventh Ward back. But it's actually then, how do we as human beings bounce back? How do we have the mental, emotional fortitude to be able to do that? How does then the ecology around us bounce back? To me, community vitality is where we try to think about all the parts and components, to Ilya's point, the system of systems that make up a community, but how do we make them more able to bounce back from these acute traumas while still maintaining an upward path in the fight against those chronic traumas that happen all the time, right? To build those capacities. So we're building, as we call it, adaptive capacity. That's the language you use in resilient science. But this is really thinking about adaptive capacity, both for the chronic and acute, but it's not just merely, it's a physical infrastructure, it's the ecological, it's the economic infrastructures that we have in place. And certainly it's our personal social. And so to me, a vital community with gaining vitality is, well, those are all coming together, and people as a community come together to try to work towards strengthening all four pillars of what it is, those kind of four pillars. In the work I'm doing, like I said, we're working hard on trying to put, kind of using things like the anchor benchmarking process to try to categorize and have ways we can score and understand where we sit on a spectrum of where that might be. And so we've come up with 16 dimensions of how we might do that. We can talk about that later in some of my research and how we think about communities understanding their planning and their development in a way that would actually lead to these things. But that's really the core of it. How do we bounce back better? How do we enable it so that we can, emotionally, physically, ecologically, and economically all bounce back in a way that makes things better for everybody going forward?
Great. And Antoine, your perspective.
Excellent. And thanks for everyone's perspective here. I really enjoyed it. And I'm going to piggyback off Eric just a second here. And I love how he referenced resilience and bouncing back. And one of the things I always ask is, why do we always have to bounce backwards? Why can't we bounce forward? And I think that's exactly what you were getting at there. We don't always have to bounce back. There are ways to take these and move forward, right? And move the progress needle. One of the things we realize about disasters are they provide opportunities, but how we take advantage of those opportunities, or whether we do or not, really impacts those communities that we serve. So to kind of answer your question here, I started to really think about community vitality, right? And I think we all understand what community is, but vitality is not a word that we use regularly. It's not in my everyday vernacular. I don't go around and say, hey, the vitality of this it's not something that we use regularly. So I looked up the definition, and the definition that I found was the power of giving continuance of life, or it is really the state of being strong and active. It's an energy, right? So from my perspective, when I think about community vitality, I think it's what brings communities life, right? It's our cultures, it's our traditions that we go through. It's not really a construct of our race, ethnicity, gender, age, or level of education, but it's who we are. It's the individuals and the families that make up those communities that give communities life. And in our work, whether it's emergency management or engineering or any of the disciplines that tie into crisis or disasters or the things that we go through on a daily, community vitality is about constantly giving life. I know particularly for emergency management, we always speak about protecting life and property, right? How can we sustain life? How can we keep that same community energy? How can we put back into that community the energy that they're needed to bounce back or bounce forward, right? So when I think about community vitality, I think it's really important to understand that a lot of those factors that I mentioned before, race, ethnicity, gender, age, level of education, and income, those are factors that do contribute to disproportionate impacts that decrease resiliency in many ways. And, you know, it's not that communities of color or low-income communities are less resilient than wealthier communities. And in so many different ways, both communities are resilient, right? But are we giving life back to them? Are we really providing the vitality and the energy that they need to be resilient? And a lot of times we aren't. Either it's a program or a policy or a decision that was made that contributed to an inequity or a disparity, right? So when we think about community vitality, and I talk more about giving life to these things, it's really about saying, what are the root causes of these things? What can we do to address the root causes that put all of us at an equitable level, right? Not equal, but equitable, right? We have to approach this from a lens of equity that really continues to breathe life into those communities. For example, if you look at social determinants of health is what we call it, or social vulnerability emergency management, we could think about a lot of the campaigns and the things that go out there, but we have to understand that everything starts at a community level. In public health, we often say that our first line of the defense is the community. It's our primary care physicians. It's our local health clinics, right? We could do a federal campaign on breast cancer and say we need to increase those rates, but the people that are actually doing the mammograms, that are doing the assessments, are your doctors. They're in the community. They're the ones that are coming up with the data that's provided to the county, and that county level data fuels federal policy and things like that, right? So I say all that to say that the work that IDEM does is rooted in data, but a lot of it is really rooted in community engagement. We have to understand both the quantitative and the data aspects, but then what we miss out on a lot of times is what gives that community life. And it's that qualitative concept, the ability to be able to engage with communities, to understand what their needs are, to make sure that they're included in the process. And once we start to do that, then we can better understand how we can be more resilient. So I'll kind of stop there.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and certainly appreciate everyone's perspective. But I think we sort of ultimately got to sort of the same core of sort of thinking holistically, at the community level, and really, making sure that community members and individuals and the community as a whole sort of have the resources and tools to be able to sort of thrive in their communities. I'll give sort of a little bit of sense from my perspective, both at the Code Council and Anchor. I really have the opportunity to sort of work from, the individual building level that Ilya talked about, of, assuring that, each individual structure is safe and addresses the resilience, indoor environmental quality challenges, at that scale. But then at Anchor, we have the opportunity to sort of build off of that, to sort of expand that to look at, the broader community challenges. And so, as I mentioned up front, Anchor is really focused on the social, organizational, and infrastructural aspects of communities, and really what contributes to their resilience. When Anchor formed, there was really sort of this recognition that, a lot of what were, sort of called resilience initiatives maybe focused on, individual disciplines or individual systems, and really work to maybe optimize, those systems, but, without sort of perspective or consideration of, how those systems interact with each other, and then ultimately, create resilient communities. And so, when we talk about sort of the social benchmarks that Anchor is developing, it's things like, cultural and recreational resources, affordability and availability of housing, education-related issues, and those sorts of things. And then, looking at sort of the organizational aspects, it's things like, public health, the business community, finance, and then, the infrastructural aspects are things that, sort of most folks are immediately drawn to, when we talk about resilience, transportation, energy, water, those sorts of things. But, really it's sort of at that core of being able to look across, all of those. We typically sort of talk about a community is only as resilient as its weakest link. And so, if you're only concentrating on sort of one or two aspects of a community, you're sort of perpetuating those weak links. And I think COVID in particular has maybe illustrated, where some of those weak links are, where, previously we've sort of been able to put Band-Aids on, some of the challenges, but I think it's really, coming to the fore. So why don't I give you guys a sort of an opportunity, maybe to riff off some of the definitions that you've heard, anything that is maybe eye-opening or sort of brings up other thoughts, around sort of this definition or concept of community vitality. Kathryn, you want to start?
Sure. And Antoine, I love that you actually went and looked up vitality to bring us back to the dictionary definition. That was awesome. So I actually have something to respond to from Antoine's more extended remarks when you're talking about equitable approaches to advancing vitality, especially in the context of extreme events and climate events. So we're looking, at Smart Growth America, we're focused on resilience, but we're actually, increasingly not using that term because often there is a connotation that, communities that have been historically marginalized by land use policy have been essentially forced to be resilient, forced to bounce back again and again on account of living in parts of communities which are more susceptible to climate hazards, having fewer infrastructural investments, protecting their households from climate hazards. So, looking at equitable approaches to adapting and addressing that problem rather than expecting that communities would bounce back and experience that trauma again and again. So, this is, I think there's always an evolution of language and policy discussions here. So that's been something which we have been focused on. So that's one point I wanted to share to build from our conversation. I'll also build on that discussion of vitality and like the intangibles there. Something that we're focused on as well, which is I think part of the bigger discussion, though maybe less of a focus in emergency management and resilience, is looking at strategies like inclusionary zoning for both households and for businesses to help protect community character and to avoid the concept of cultural displacement. So you may zoning may require for a certain percentage of new affordable housing units, but if all of the local businesses move on as the neighborhood changes in terms of property values, there may be, that vitality is lost, or people who are able to stay in a unit may no longer feel that same connection to the neighborhood if the businesses no longer cater to the historic residents of the neighborhood. So I think, in all of the planning and policy discussions, there are these intersectional issues around preparedness, planning, and planning for both future development and for supporting the current development of a neighborhood. So those are a few comments, and I'm excited to hear what else others wanted to build from.
Great. Ilya, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I want to respond as well, and I appreciate what Kathryn brought forward. A few things that I would love to drill down on. Eric brought up adaptive resilience, and we're also talking about the Band-Aid approach, and that's come up a couple of times. If we've made this leap from an engineered resilience, which is like a levee wall, to an adaptive resilience, which is looking at the constant change, and so there is this adaptation going on. That's where we're at today. But I think what we're all eating around the edge of the crust, now we have to taste and see what the pie actually is about regeneration. And how do we not just go from this extractive economy and extractive way of doing things to what everyone's talking about is regenerate or bouncing forward, but in a regenerative way that brings to mind the ecosystems that we have to really engage. And the idea that Kathryn brought up, and Ryan, you brought up as well, is this idea of uniqueness of place. If all disasters are local, all responses are local. And if all responses are local, then the uniqueness of place, including the adaptive systems of ecology, the adaptive systems of society, and those social systems, as well as the ecology and the climate, are all in that consideration. Because quite frankly, we just went through the pandemic. And so we know we can't go back to the way it was before. There was an inflection point that recognized the 20th century of doing things is something we were comfortable with, but it was not necessarily good for us. And now, just like we're on Zoom today, this is completely different way of doing things, and so too is our cities. The notion of a 15-minute city is harkening back to a 19th century or even an earlier model where everything is produced within a very short distance that gives vitality and livelihood. We're now moving back towards that because of resource stress, wars overseas, production limitations. And that is a good thing, because when you think about where we started this about systems and systems thinking, a localized, very autonomous system, whether it's food production, energy production, housing, social networks, if those are locally driven and locally supported, that is resilience. And that turns into a regenerative model that then can support ecosystems in the street. That to me is where I'm hopeful we are going. And that's where I'm hearing these pieces that are right at the heart of the kind of work I love doing and the kind of the policy I want to drive. Thanks.
Great. Eric, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, there's a couple things that come out of the comments that I've heard both from Kathryn and Anton, as well as what Ilya was saying. One was the thing to think about here is we think about community vitality. While we think about trying to be self-reliant or having the ability for that community, that I think we also have to fully recognize that actually it is not self-reliant. It's actually the ability to understand our ties and connections to everything around us. You know, you look at, say, New York City, right? And you think about the idea of a 15-minute city. It's frankly impossible to feed New York City. So if you look at the total agricultural catchment area for a place like New York City, you're basically going to require, just for that city alone, never minding from the Boston to Washington corridor, but just New York City alone, the catchment area for agricultural requirements for that would extend all the way to Ohio, just to be able to feed New York City. And by the way, there's Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and other things that are feeding off that same. And so we've got to understand the interdependencies, which I love Kathryn talking about, was that we are very independent. And we got to think about now, we start talking about equity and equitable solutions. We've got to be able to draw in the rural America, the non-urban America, into our urban solutions. A lot of times in the work I do, I'm working with communities far flung that have small, really cool old downtowns that were built back in the 1950s model of an auto-centric world. Not necessarily, sometimes they were good walking, sometimes they're not. But they still are really fundamentally not going to be able to implement everything that, say, we have available in smart growth principles. Like they would love to, but they just maybe don't have that density. And for lots of reasons, we spread out with suburbia, and that created problems. Jeff Speck famously wrote, Suburbanation, right? And talked about the challenges in it. So how do we now reinvest in our communities in a way that brings equity there? Because part of the redlining we saw for especially diverse communities was specifically to exclude people from those opportunities. We have to break those down and really rethink it. And so, the work we're doing in all these different things, whether it be Anchor and what they're doing, whether it's Smart Growth America, whether it be the diversity inclusion efforts, what Ilya is doing, we've got to think about this in diversity equity across space and across locations, across different things, so that we really think about this as an inclusive activity, an equitable activity that doesn't leave out rural America. So we talk about improving our cities, that can really become very tone deaf to everybody who lives in Joe Farm country. So we got to figure out how we think about this, that's part of the picture, and too often that can become a problem in our conversation. And the last part was the idea of adaptive capacity that Ilya was talking about. We've got to think about in those interdependencies, where can we source those things we need and bring them closer to us? How do we have those exchanges? So I'll just do a personal story on this. So I grew up in central New York, Syracuse area, but my mother's family was from New York City, the Bridgeport, Connecticut, but basically in the outskirts of the New York metro area, right? So I spent a lot of time going back and forth to the city. My father's family is from where I'm at now, in the middle of northern New York. I have to explain to people, no, I'm nowhere near Buffalo. I'm nowhere near Albany. I'm an hour from Ottawa, right? And up here, it's like rural nobody land. And so being able to learn to ride the subway, but at the same time milk a cow, it was a great experience for someone. But we don't have those exchanges as much anymore. We need to think about how this activity we're talking about bridges people back together. I would argue some of our political and social stresses we have right now could be greatly bridged. We start thinking about these solutions in a way that we bring those things back together, because we've had common purpose in the past historically. We've left others out. If we can bring them into the conversation of that common purpose, then we can really build things. And that's where vitality happens, when we bring people together in common purpose and make these happen, not because they have to, because they want to. And you see where this is taking them.
Yeah, really appreciate that perspective, Eric. And I think, it's interesting and sad, some of the sort of stories we hear about folks maybe who think their food comes from a grocery store, but doesn't really understand sort of the multiple steps, behind that. And so, being able to sort of break down, our own little sort of lane of perspective, and really understanding, where, all of those pieces come from, where various different, people with different experiences, come from as well, I think is really important to help, drive this conversation. Antoine, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been great to listen to, everybody's response here. And, one of the things that I think about community vitality, and it's kind of twofold to me, right? So we're talking about a lot of different disciplines and factors. We're talking engineering, natural built environment. We've talked about social statuses and all those things. So when I think about community vitality, it's all of those factors that give our communities life. But on the other hand, it's all of the influences that take life away, right? That takes away from the communities. And those are the things that I think that we're talking about addressing. So I really like Eric's statement regarding interconnectedness, right? And in so many ways, we're all working in our own lanes. We have public health practitioners working, we have engineers working, and we're operating in silos for a common cause, but we never connect those silos. We don't do a good job at connecting them, right? So when we operate in silo, we're all typically competing against each other, so to speak. I'm trying to do this here, you're trying to do that there. We're all trying to do the same thing, and we've never thought to connect, right? And that's one of the core components of communities. When we think about community vitality, it's your mom and pop shops, but it's also your large industries, your Walmarts and your Targets. It's also the rec centers, right? It's also the schools. It's also transportation. It's all of these different things that connect to make a community work. So I think what I'm trying to get out here is that when we operate in silo, we're basically saying, I'm just going to focus on one thing here, and I'm going to hope that it's going to influence the entire community. And it won't. We have to start to connect, right? And that's what really breeds kind of that environment that we want when we talk about community vitality. All of these pieces have to work together. And I think that it's important when we think about resilience. Resilience is a very broad concept, right? And then there's a lot of sub-concepts under them. So there's not one set approach to resilience. There's multiple approaches to it. And again, going back to Ilya's comments about systems, all of these create a system, right? That works. So if our system is not working, I think there's always, I learned in school when you had the gears and one gear messed up and the whole thing just stops working, right? That's just a simple analogy from like elementary school, but it makes perfect sense. If one thing is not working, then it becomes a problem, And then to Kathryn's point, you're right. There is a lot about policy and practice. And I think Eric touched on this too. We have to start to look at those policies and those practices, right? In every which way of our work, and this is not to point blame. I hate the blame game. We don't do blame and shame here, right? But in every way, we all contribute to some form of inequity or disparity in every way, whether it's a system that we work in at our jobs, whether it's the work that we do that's guided by policy, whether it's a program that has specific regulations and stipulations that we have to follow, whether we can't evaluate certain things because there's not metrics and things in place. At every step, we all contribute to some form of disparity or inequity. So I think when we think about community vitality, we have to think about where our contributions exist in that model, right? And then begin to really explore. And again, the communities have to be at the forefront of it. We have to start to really include them. I often told this story with Ryan, but excuse me, I've done a lot of community work. And what happens is you go to the town hall, and the town hall will have 150 people there, and you say, great, this is a great issue. We need to take it up. Right? And then you get to the Board of Commissioners office, and it's probably you and 50 people from the community there making your claim. Making your claim, and you say, great, we need to move it up. You get to the mayor, and it's maybe 15 people there. By the time it gets to the governor, it's just you there, and you and the governor, and no longer is the community present, right? So even in that process of how we influence policy, how we influence programs, the community always gets left behind. So we have to be intentional about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and make sure that we're focusing on the communities, whether it's community-based participatory research or making sure that not only do they have a seat at the table, because you can have everybody at the table, but are they listening? We have to make sure that people are listening. We don't necessarily need to be the voice, but we need to create an environment that's not even a safe space, but a brave space where people can speak out about these things. There are a lot of people that really want to talk about these issues, but it's not a space where they feel comfortable doing it, right? And it doesn't create an environment that's brave enough for them to say, this is an issue, and I've been in these communities, right? So we have to kind of get beyond where we exist in the model of the problem and really work towards being more of the solution.
Great. Yeah, definitely appreciate everyone's perspective there, and maybe picking up on what Antoine mentioned. We don't have really programs that say this is a community vitality program. We also sort of talk about resilience building or those sorts of things. What are some maybe existing initiatives that you've been involved in, or that you've been following that you feel has a really good community vitality sort of outcome or intention, to those efforts? And then I guess maybe a sort of a corollary, what things are missing from that conversation? What sort of programs, tools, initiatives, resources do we need to get to the community vitality, that we've been talking about? So I don't know who wants to start. Eric,
go ahead and jump in first, because I've actually been thinking about some of what Anton was spurring some of us on, and actually your earlier question. So one of the things I'm very involved with right now is a little bit of a USGBC plug here, but Lead for Communities, Lead for Cities. You may have heard of this. This is something that's been released fairly certainly. We've been doing a lot of using it and evaluating it as part of my research team to say, hey, how is this thing really kicking the tires? And it's been a great tool for many different kinds of communities and cities. And it is they smartly kind of have communities and they have cities, so it's really scalable to really rethink and bring in this holistic approach, really bringing it, because it looks at things from educational outcomes to the level of greenhouse gas emissions, to vehicle mile travel per capita, to the whole spectrum of different things are being brought into the questions for what does it make for a community to be vibrant and growing and going in the right direction. The hardest part of the process, though, is all this takes effort. So if you want to have a system that's going to help you, guide you, and it's a great system, it's a great certification process, it's a great tool, but it takes a lift to do it. And one of the things we really have got to get our heads around, and I think this is going any community, whether it be inner city or utterly rural, is how do we resource the human resources really to be able to facilitate on an ongoing basis these efforts. It's not a do it once and you're done. If we're going to talk about vital communities that are going to go forward and have vitality, they need to have those resources to be able to do it on an ongoing basis and make it persistent within their communities so they can do it. And things like Lead for Communities, it is a significant lift just to gather the data, to do the planning, the development, all that is a significant lift for any community. And the biggest challenge we've seen is that if you look at who's adopting it, for most part, it's those that have the wherewithal with staffing and things like that to do that, which leaves a lot of communities out of the question that they can do this. But we need to have mechanisms to do that. And I think there's going to have to be a social change in how we think about where people are able to spend their time. We may need to think about, how we think about work in relation to our responsibilities to our communities, and what does our civic life look like? I think that's an important part of our conversation. And it also gets back to what are the technical tools that we can grasp onto more effectively now, as they've developed, to be able to make some of these things more in stride with what we're already doing. Instead of having to go out and find things, can we bring that through data science and other tools? Can we bring that in a more meaningful way at the right time to be able to make these things better? So I would say Lead for Communities, Lead for Cities is doing some phenomenal work, doing great things, but there is that lift challenge that comes into play.
Yeah, really appreciate that perspective. And, Anchor certainly has, a similar challenge of, engaging communities and really, taking those steps to move forward. I mean, one of the things that we've particularly looked at is, what are some of the add-on benefits that, going through, benchmarking or Lead for Cities, sort of process can really provide. And it moves beyond, sort of just the resilience aspects of the communities to think about, sort of economic development opportunities and opportunities to attract, new businesses or support, grant making for improving the community even further, and really, sort of building beyond just, sort of the community itself to regional activities as well. Any other sort of programs or activities, or maybe even gaps that folks see, that are maybe really driving towards that community vitality? Ilya, go ahead.
I can jump in and talk a little bit about some gaps. I think there's the training for true community engagement. There are a few elements out there, but to have that as something that is not often available to those who want to lead these efforts. I think that's one piece. Another piece is that the community engagement is required by so many elements for funding and advancing resilience. And I'll give you a good example for brick funding. For example, we're working with an at-risk community in Hawaii. And this is a community of around 7,000 Native Hawaiians in a region of 26,000 that has no community resilience hubs or shelters. So they've been fighting for 30 years to bring about the building of a structure. But quite frankly, in the communication of that, they really weren't looking at the underlying community issues. So my team was asked to join in, but what it turned into was understanding what the city needed and the environmental assessment needed for any advancement of that was all about community engagement. And once the community went through that engagement, the sort of self-analysis and reflection saying it's not about a shelter, it's about something so much more. It was about a regenerative process for community and culture that, by the way, needed some kind of anchor structure. And that is sort of the realization. So I think the community engagement is embedded so much in how we're moving incrementally along at building resilient capacity in our communities. It's the unevenness of how, one, we communicate goals and targets, how the community is engaged, and to Antoine's point, how the community can remain engaged as the authentic voice in advocacy. So as an architect, and I often tell this to my colleagues, your job when you go into the community is they have the ideas. They really know what they need once you work with them. And it's your job is to translate those ideas into something that is palatable or recognizable to the lawmakers and funding streams so they recognize what they are going to pay for. You're translating the need into tangible ideas that can be funded. And I think that's where, one, the kind of gap is in understanding engagement, two, the training, and three, the overarching need for more and more of it. And I guess I'll stop there. I mean, there's great examples that we've worked with you, Ryan, with Anchor in Oakland Park, Florida, and it really is a revelation to, we've been doing all these great things, but they've been doing them in certain sectors. And once they realized, well, we've been doing these sectors, but here's the other sectors, to Antoine's point, there's things that are going to fail because they're good in one thing, but poor in another. So the community fails, right? So anyway, I think that's some of the things going on.
Yeah, no, that's great. And maybe expand on that a little bit. So you talked about
Sure.
sort of the opportunity for architects to help in that community engagement role. What other sort of members of the community or other sort of disciplines should have those types of skills, and sort of how do we build that?
Yeah, and in my experience, the broad spectrum of stakeholders is vast, but the community leaders that hits each of those sectors or touch points of those sectors, whether it's community banking, finance, jobs, education, everything from education down to daycare, transportation. It is really a cross-sectoral piece. And so when we have these community engagements, it is required to have all of the city or state folks that are necessary to answer the substantive questions, to flesh out those sectors and how that community relates to those sectors. And it's important that those representatives from government hear that the community is what's lacking or what the mismatch is for that community. We have 7,000 people, but we have only 2 buses that stop every day. That kind of interaction begins to pull the report, the outcomes together that leads to action. So I think that's some of it. It's hard to define because, again, the uniqueness of place, every community is different. And if you begin this engagement, there will be some natural partners and then some that are unnatural. And I'll give you one quick example. After Hurricane Harvey, we were asked to come to Houston to run a community-based workshop. And we were asked by engineers and architects local and some community members. When we suggested that we had Big Oil join us, they all stood back, and I said, you have to. They're the largest job supplier, and they're the largest financial institute or contributor to Houston. Once Big Oil got in there, they were so interested in building resilient capacity because the workers and the families were the ones that most at risk for their livelihoods. It was all about vitality of the family. It wasn't about producing more oil. It was about saving jobs, people, and place. And so sometimes your unnatural partner is your partner. You have to think at what Antoine said and Kathryn said, that community is, you've got to look back. It is the collection of everything. And so we need to be honest with what is in the community to begin to address those things.
Great. Yeah, Kathryn, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's so much to answer or to respond to in this question, but I want to build off something that Ilya was discussing around strategies for involving stakeholders. And this also starts to address one of the questions in the chat around engaging community members. You know, as Smart Growth America, we're a technical assistance provider. So we're often partnering with community-based organizations and local governments to design engagement strategies. So, you know, a critical approach for us is ensuring that people are compensated for their time, for coming in, for their expertise, to make it, you know, worth their while, to recognize the expertise and the need for the input into the project, and to try to address some of the systemic barriers that can, you know, make it more difficult for people to come to meetings. So childcare, providing meals, et cetera. But taking it to the next level, and I think this is what can really, you know, couldn't be a key strategy in getting to vitality, is actually partnering with community-based organizations, you know, not just on engagement, like come to the meeting, sit on a working group, actually partnering with community-based organizations in the entire strategy and planning for the project. So we hosted a webinar on equitable brownfields redevelopment recently, and we had, you know, as an example of a project, the leader of, I believe it was the Philip Randolph Institute in San Francisco. And this is a community-based organization. Historically, they've done a lot of voter registration and grassroots organizing. And they were one of the full partners developing a plan for this large brownfield redevelopment project in their community. So, you know, they were working along with the Parks and Rec Department, Trust for Public Land, and others. And, you know, that's in a funded sub-consultant capacity, as opposed to, you know, compensation to individuals for coming in at targeted points during the meeting and engagement process. So I think that kind of partnership, you know, is a key strategy for advancing vitality and for having that community vision be a core part of the plan that's ultimately developed and implemented. Also just add another comment on, you know, the capacity challenges around engagement, like something that I noticed as a younger planner working in post-Katrina New Orleans. We were doing an identical planning process in some high resource neighborhoods as well as lower income neighborhoods. And, you know, people who were engaged, you know, were, you know, when there are so many needs, they're focusing on the, you know, the absolute immediate needs of secure housing, you know, a place for kids to play, walkability to school. You know, and then when there is an identical process where a high resource neighborhood has a, you know, well-organized and well-funded business community, they were actually asking the planning teams for different things that would, you know, systems thinking, changing the overall economic development opportunities in the neighborhood. So, you know, I think that was an issue where the planning process was not well designed, because it, you know, is an inequitable situation if you're asking people to respond and say what their needs are, and you know, the areas where there are higher needs are focused on just that kind of immediate priorities, versus the systems changes, which can then lead to more, shared prosperity and economic development longer term.
Great. Yeah, definitely appreciate the example. Antoine, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think these are all really good points, and there are a lot of good questions about engagement here. And I think one of the most important things about engagement, and Kathryn touched on this, is sometimes you just have to meet the community where they're at. It's really that simple. I know I grew up with a mother, a single mom, and she was in the military, and she worked and, in the day, and then sometimes she worked evening jobs. So you can't have your 12 o'clock planning meeting at lunch and say, well, it's lunchtime, it's the perfect time to do it. No way she can make it. Have it at 7 o'clock at night. Yeah, it's tough. Nobody wants to work past 5, right? But sometimes you got to get out there at 7 o'clock at night and say, this is the opportunity to speak on these things. Another point that Kathryn made again is, community-based organizations. But I also go further and say, get to know some of the individuals in your community. Every community has an unofficial mayor. I guarantee it. It's somebody in that community that has been there 30 years, that knows your grandmother, that knows your mom. She saw you when you was in diapers. She knows everybody's business, she or he. She knows who your cousin is that you didn't know was your cousin. It was, but they know everything, but they have so much power and influence in the community. Those are the people that you start to invite to the table, and you bring them in. So if you're having a conversation and you're saying, I'm trying to do outreach, or I think there was a question there about getting communities to understand urgency, and you're trying to reach maybe a Hispanic or a Latin community, and you say, all right, we need to come up with a solid communication and outreach strategy. Find out who that person is and say, would you be interested in serving on my council? Would you be interested in doing this? Or would you identify stakeholders, members of the community that would do that? You can do that through community-based organizations, but sometimes working in the community is really what's important. They typically know their needs better than anyone because they've been there for 30 years. I can go into any community with all of my degrees and say, I know what's best for you guys, but I really don't. I haven't lived there. I haven't seen the changes. I don't know where you were 60. I wasn't even around in the 60s, so I can't tell you about the 60s, right? But they can. So, those are the things that are really important, is actually getting out and being intentional about it, right? So again, I mentioned that inclusion is not just giving everybody a seat at the table, but it's bringing them up with you, right? And really engaging with them, speaking to them. Sometimes just doing subtle things, because there's general, mistrust in government or in people that don't look like you in the community. He ain't from around here. I don't know him. I don't know her, right? Sometimes just being intentional about little actions, even in your everyday work life, like for emergency management, you can put out preparedness flyers all day, and if they're all in English, it does nothing for a lot of people. Provide it in Spanish. Put a link on there that translates your entire site to Spanish. Yeah, it's a little extra work, right? But if they can't understand English, they see Espanol at the top, they click it, boom. Everything you need is right there. Learn about what those different languages in your community are. So you may have English, you may have Spanish, you may have French. You say, I covered the big 3. There's probably a Creole community there. There might be a Vietnamese fishing community there, right? So be intentional about understanding your communities. And sometimes you don't know that unless you just get out there and really start to include them in that process. So that's just a couple of things I'm throwing out there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Eric?
Yeah, so and riffing off that even more is, you've got to think about this in the whole of the people. And thinking about where they gather. So going to where they are, but it's also where are they gathering and where are they engaging. And I will tell you, the most important thing to learn is a story. I know there's lots of things, but we need to understand the story. So the one question was about this idea of trauma-informed engagement. And I think it's a great phraseology, but it's actually more, it's experience informed. What is their experience? What's their lived experience? I live here immediately adjacent to me. I live on the land, the traditional lands of the Akwesasne Haudenosaunee tribe, right? Or nation, I should say, because that's what they call themselves. And I've learned a ton from them in terms of understanding, hey, how do they think? They think the 7 generations of Haudenosaunee is a great, how do we think? And they think backwards and forwards that way. So we think about bouncing forward. So for them, there's a whole story about how things are, and they haven't gone anywhere. They're still here. They weren't, we came and occupied stuff, but they're still with us. How do you listen to that? But there's also, we have a huge Amish population. what's their story? How do they come here in our local community? So each community is like that. What are those stories and how do you connect with that? And how do you learn about that story? One of the first places I try to go to in a community when I start trying to find where's the kind of the museum or historic society or organization there that gives me that, because inevitably there's things like photographs, there's things like family names, there's things like that just you'll see it on street signs, you'll see it other places. There's markers of this story, but if we can understand the story, that's a great way to gain entry. And then the question on urgency, I thought was another one which Kathryn and Antoine both talked about. But I'll tell you, there's nothing like saying that your family and ancestral location is at imminent threat. So my parents do a lot of work right now in the St. Bernard County, St. Bernard Parish, excuse me, in Louisiana. Kathryn, I'm sure you're familiar with this. There are family homes that have been there since the French arrived, right, or even earlier. They're native folks there. They're basically their homes are being devastated year after year after year because of the changes of climate change, and that has really changed their mindset about what is important and changed their idea about what needs to be done. They've realized that the walls are only going to do so much for them. There's so much more that they need to do, and you're seeing vitality come out of those communities. They've really come up with ways that they're doing it. Whole first floors that get washed out, but basically that's okay. That's how they're going to live. And they've changed their lifestyle. They've changed their social, and they're becoming interdependent, but are also becoming more self-reliant even though they're independent. It's kind of this great thing where they're trying to do it, but it's not easy, and it takes work, but they're doing it. And I think that's it's part of their story. What is that story? How can we learn from the story to carry that forward?
Great. So we have about 15 minutes, and did really want to provide an opportunity for folks that are participating in the webinar to maybe share your thoughts relative to community vitality. So if folks are interested, certainly raise your hand, and Medea can unmute you. But I think the sort of key questions maybe if participants are interested is sort of how would you define community vitality, and sort of how does it fit into the work that you do? So certainly, if folks are interested in raising your hand, I would certainly encourage you to do that. Are there any other thoughts from the panelists, sort of while we're waiting to see if there's sort of broader input?
There is a question that came in the chat that I thought was interesting. This point of immediate priorities, food on the table versus systems change, sustainable local farms, that gets out ahead of the crisis mode is our current construct and a gridlock point. How do we do both well? How do we do both the immediate and the long term at the same time? I think it's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say I can kind of jump in on that question. I always talk about root causes of vulnerability. So the one important thing is understanding that if you don't really address the root causes of vulnerability, then it's really hard to get ahead. If there's lack of access and I can't get adequate health care, then it's really hard to, try to put a system or anything in place that doesn't address those immediate needs. I mean, it really starts with Maslow, right? So that's my push for always addressing root causes. But to answer that question, a lot of this has to happen in what we call an emergency management and maybe other fields, but blue sky days, blue sky planning, right? So there are an understanding of the immediate needs, getting out and understanding the community. And then there's also the systems changes that need to happen. And we can't wait to do those when something happens, when a crisis or a disaster is upon us. We can't wait until the sky is gray, the rain is coming down, and things are getting out of hand to finally say, we need to change. And our posture has normally been reactive to almost everything, right? So we have to get away from being reactive and then being more proactive. And a lot of that needs to happen during blue sky planning. So while the weather is nice, while we have the opportunity, create those, break those silos, connect those silos, begin to think about the systems and think about how those systems can be implemented in the community where it's at. If we don't understand where the community is at, then let's take some time to truly understand where we are demographically, socially, and all of that. And then you adapt, because these systems are all designed, right? These are designs, they didn't come out of nowhere. Systems are designed. These are decision makers that develop these systems. You adapt those systems to those communities. You take into account the needs or where the vulnerabilities exist, and then you create those systems that are tailored to each community. Again, it's more work, got to be intentional. But when you do that and you do it in blue skies, then you can start to implement it while things are kind of going through it becomes a part of daily order, right? It's what we do every day. We're implementing this program every day. We're working to improve this every day. But when we do it reactionary, or when we kind of wait till that gray sky is upon us, it becomes a problem. So my advice, or at least just my recommendation for that question, is keep doing what you're doing, develop that system, but then also develop it to where it's tailored for where the community is at and where those needs exist. And you'll find that it'll serve two fulfilling purposes. One, it'll meet the needs and create a little more equity, but then it'll also start to lend to an available system. The last thing I got is always evaluate. I don't think we do enough evaluation. We don't look at our metrics and measures. A lot of time, these programs, these policies, they give us data. And if we don't take those data, those metrics and those measures, and we look at where we're improving or where we're not improving or what we can adjust along the way, and there's 4 types of evaluation. You could do it when you're thinking of the program or the system. You can do it during process and implementation, where you're constantly making improvements. And then you can look at outcomes, and then you can also look at impacts. So we got to start to look at how we evaluate and look at those key metrics and measures. And I mean, if we just follow that throughout the process, I think it'll make it a little bit easier. Thanks.
Yeah, certainly appreciate that perspective and really the importance of metrics. I think one sort of important warning, I guess, maybe is sort of understanding maybe what's behind some of those metrics and maybe some of the sort of hidden things that they may be pointing to, which may go counter to some of the equity and those sorts of challenges. Would certainly recommend a book for folks. Weapons of Mass Destruction really gets to some of those challenges and really understanding sort of what impact what seems as potentially sort of harmless or informative metrics or information can really be detrimental to various different communities. Kathryn, you want to pick up on that?
Sure. And I feel like this conversation's flown by today, by the way. It's been really fun, both discussing this with all of you and seeing all the audience and attendee responses in the chat and the Q&A. Realizing we just had 10 minutes left, I wanted to, pose a question or provide an additional topic for everyone to put into the mix on community vitality. Given the moment that we're in, I realize, the incredible influx of federal funding for community development and infrastructure related opportunities has actually barely come up today. We've had so much to discuss. So I wanted to put it out there, to everyone that, this is a big moment. The infrastructure dollars are about to flow to local communities. And, from our organizational perspective, without, strong local advocacy and local action, these dollars are likely to flow to projects which will not advance community vitality. Highway expansions, projects which could divide communities or which will lead to increased emissions. So, I think this is a moment where there is the potential for funding for projects which can be reflective of community values, advance climate adaptation, support people to be out of harm's way. But it's not a given. So that's a bit of a, I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say on that, maybe how your organizations are engaging, because it feels that we are in a critical moment where there is a lot of great potential, but there is also potential for more of the same.
Yeah, really appreciate you bringing that up. And certainly from both the ICC and Anchor perspective, very much interested in assuring that, projects do support community vitality and really do provide some of those holistic perspectives and community engagement that we've already talked about. Ilya,
yeah,
you have something to add?
Yeah, I wanted to just piggyback on what Kathryn said. The translation, as I mentioned before, Kathryn's bringing up a really great point, not just in the US, but globally. We have a lot of work that we're doing around the world. The most money out there for anything is disaster risk reduction. It's billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that are dedicated around the world, and they're waiting for projects. And I'll give you a quick number. This just came out in a report 2 weeks ago from the World Bank. In 2019, they only funded $188 million of disaster risk reduction for a handful of projects that were basically approved because the translation and projects weren't there. Right now, the global need is over $200 billion annually for disaster risk reduction. That's going to increase to about $500 billion by 2050 in that report. I'll post it in the chat if I can pull it up before we end. But your work is very clear. Those dollars are there, but unless you build the vehicle to get to your vision or the vision of a vital community, those dollars will, as Kathryn said, go completely other places. So our organization as the AIA, we jumped in during the pandemic and we created a series of programs, outreach to the state, the governor's office and the mayor of New York. We built all of these engines that will help communities, and many of them are now deployed. The open streets has now become permanent in New York City. Outdoor dining's become permanent. We have guidance on how to build outdoor dining, funding from the federal side to build out restaurants into the street as just a few examples. And I posted a video on some of that. But really take that in. The money is there. You have to be the visionary that matches the community need to visualize it to unlock the dollars.
And yeah, so
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Ryan. I'm sorry.
I was just to add, one other sort of perspective, and Eric touched on it. Some of the challenges of rural communities. We also know, some of the communities that have not had, prior resources invested, in those communities, access to those funds, pulling together sort of the grant writers and sort of building out the specific projects is often a challenge, and so. Being able to identify, resources to support those communities who are often the ones that need that funding the most, to be able to access that, I think is, certainly something, to talk about and identify solutions for. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, and I think Kathryn had something she wanted to add as well, but I was going to mention, while there's 1.2 or $1.3 trillion in infrastructure spending coming from the federal government, right? That's a historic, massive amount of money that Kathryn was talking about. There is some hundreds of trillions of dollars in ESG funding out there that is coming from the private sector that is addressing and wants to address the things that Ilya was talking about how do we do that? And NIBS did a multi-year study looking at just federal funded projects that they did, showing that resilience pays. I mean, there's a whole series on that shows, hey, these, yes, you're making an investment now for that future outcome, but it pays off sometimes as much as tenfold in terms of what you're getting out of that. So the ESG funders are looking for that return on investment. So if your community has done the planning and engaged in that, that's good. I will say to you, as a university guy who does a lot of work in communities, one of your most untapped resources is our institutions of higher education. You want to talk about folks that need the opportunity to learn, especially from some of our historic Black universities and other disadvantaged, the SUNY schools or your public schools. Those students are looking for experience to learn how to make things better for communities. If you can partner with those students, give them a project to work on. Hey, I need to do something with my stormwater, or I need to do something related to this social issue. Give them those projects. They are looking for those opportunities. For them, it's a resume builder, it's an experience builder, and they're got the benefit of the faculty like me who could help guide them and lead them through that process. So we should certainly tap in it. And now's the time to do it. While you are trying to figure out ways to get this money, if you've got good plans, have them help you do that. And they're a great resource to do that.
Great. So we just have about 6 minutes left. So I'll give each of you about a minute. Any sort of closing thoughts, ideas, maybe additional activities that you think need to happen. I'll start with you, Kathryn.
Ooh. Well, I think there's so many things to build from the conversation today. And, something that's always motivated me working in the built environment is that, the product, communities, people's homes, these are all the result of work in so many different disciplines from, planning, engineering, emergency preparedness. And so we all have our role in working to advance community vitality. And, the job is never done because, the world's changing and communities' needs are changing. And so policy needs to be responsive to that. So, thank you for bringing us together for the conversation. And I'll put some resources in the chat from our organization. And for folks who are interested, especially in engaging on, opportunities to advance transit and mitigation through the infrastructure bill, that's something we're focused on. Also zoning reform and participatory planning.
Great, thanks. Eric, go ahead.
My only final thought is really we've got to think about, as Anton said, bouncing forward. And so how do we understand where we're at? I think this is an opportunity to think about where we are, take an evaluation of where you are in your community, and really engage those that have not been voices before, so that we can really understand where things need to go in the future. So I implore us all to kind of think about that as we think about the vitality of our communities.
Great. Ilya.
Yeah, there's so many thoughts. I agree with my colleagues here, but just one thing is that your communities are in a state of becoming. What I mean by that is the community is never finished, so therefore your adaptive process is never finished. So build those systems, as Antoine said, but recognize the other important point they brought up is that those systems need constant adaptation to continuously meet the ongoing changes to the environment, changes to your population, changes to workforce development, all of those things. So it's that kind of always in a state of becoming, continuous adaptation is where we're at. If we can add in the sectors of biodiversity and regenerative processes, I think we'll have a chance to reverse some of the drawdown. So that's what I would leave for you all.
Great. Antoine.
Yeah, I just want to say this has been a great panel. As Erica mentioned, the time has really flown by, but I think if I have to leave with anything, it'll be about where I started, in that, for me, the definition of community vitality is, again, it's twofold. It's all of the factors that give our communities life. So everything that makes our communities breathe, everything that creates our communities, all of the systems that we were talking about, all of the disciplines that tie into it, the natural environment, the built environment, everything that gives our communities life is community vitality. But then also all of the influences that take life away. And what that means is, if there are systems or there's policies or there's things going on around us that may take life away, that also has an impact on community vitality. So, my final thoughts are, I encourage you to think about what we can do in our respective roles to give life to those communities, whether it's locally, statewide, nationally, or globally. But then also think about what may be taking life away from those, and then we can start to adapt our approaches to make sure that we're doing our due diligence. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all, and really appreciate the conversation. I think from my perspective, I hope that all of the participants today have the opportunity to sort of break out of their silos, engage their broader community, engage folks from other disciplines. And as we've seen through the diversity of experience, across our panelists today, it really does lead to really great, robust discussion and understanding. So I'm going to turn it back over to Eric and Medea. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you to our panelists, and look forward to seeing what's next.
Thank you, Ryan. And I'll just quickly say thank you to you all and the panelists that participated today. Thank you for volunteering to be part of the task force with Ryan to make this happen. And I also want to thank the steering committee for the whole series. Several of them are on: Ben Wallen, Lieutenant Colonel Ben Wallen from West Point, Lieutenant Colonel retired Joe Berbecchio, and probably several others I'm not seeing real quick on the attendance list. But thank them all for continuing this series. I think it's been an important set of conversation this year. And I've already got some topics here for next year's series, so we're looking forward to that. So thank you all for that. So with no further ado, Medea, can you close us out?
Sure. Thank you, everyone. That was a terrific conversation. And I've grabbed a lot of the links from the chat, so I'm going to send a follow-up email. And we've recorded this session, so we're going to add it to the list of sessions that are on YouTube. That I put the link to the article that has the links to our YouTube recordings as well. And we have one more session in 2 weeks, and then another one on June 15th. And thank you so much to our panelists and everybody who was here. Take care and have a great rest of your day. Thanks.